When you get the player to the sideline, start some basic sideline management. The typical mild injury, without any of the red flags we'll talk about in a minute, should be treated on the sideline with rest, ice compression, and elevation, otherwise known as RICE. An obvious deformity should not be set back in place unless you have specific training to do so. Don't attempt to do something you're not trained to do. Instead, call local emergency services or 911 for transport. And while you're waiting, apply the principles of RICE to the best of your ability and keep the player calm. Let's review some of the red flags. A direct tackle to the thigh, knee, or leg in any sport is a very dangerous play and will often result in a severe injury. Use some common sense here. If you saw the play and it looked bad to you, it probably is. If the player reports a pop or a crack associated with immediate pain, this is usually a sign of a more severe injury. Immediate swelling or bruising are also red flags. Significant tenderness with light touch is a red flag. And finally, a player unable to move the leg on his or her own or bear weight on the injured leg is a red flag needing proper evaluation by a physician. So, should the athlete play or sit out? In any of the red flag situations where something is definitely wrong, the player should be transported to the emergency room. If a player having nagging chronic pain reports to you that he or she cannot run, if the pain is affecting play, then have the player sit out, apply RICE, and recommend to the parents that the player be evaluated by a physician. These players will often need a prolonged period of rest and rehabilitation before they can return successfully to play. So here's your take-home message for mild injuries. Occasionally, a player with a mild injury will recover after sitting out for some time with RICE applied. That player can return to the training session or game 20 minutes after the ice is removed if there is no pain, full motion, and normal ability to do a functional test. It only takes a few seconds to do a functional test on the field or sideline, and it's very useful. Watch them jog, sprint, cut, pivot, and jump. If everything looks normal and there are no red flags, it is generally fine to have them return to play. As always, we strongly recommend that if you have any questions about the player's safety or readiness to play, then have them sit out. Don't risk turning a mild injury into something worse. It's better to sit a player for a week or two than lose the player for the entire season. I'm Dr. Brian Cole for Sideline Sports Doc. Thank you for listening.